Have you ever had that gut feeling? That strange sensation in the pit of your stomach telling you something is not right with what someone is saying? I certainly have, and it changed my life in ways I never expected. 3 years ago, I sat across from Zachary Langston, a business partner I had trusted with nearly everything. His words flowed smoothly as he explained why our company had lost $50,000 in a failed venture. Everything sounded logical. Everything seemed airtight. Yet something felt wrong. We simply could not have predicted the market shift, Zach said, maintaining perfect eye contact. Nobody saw it coming. I nodded along, unable to pinpoint what was bothering me. It was only months later, after discovering he had diverted funds to a personal project, that I realized what I had missed. The signs had been there all along, in his body language, his micro-expressions, the subtle inconsistencies in his behavior that my conscious mind failed to register but my instincts had detected. That experience sent me on a 3-year journey, studying behavioral psychology, interviewing law enforcement interrogation specialists, and consulting with body language experts. What I discovered transformed not only my business relationships but every human interaction in my life. The truth is, most of us miss up to 93% of communication because we focus almost exclusively on words. But words are precisely what liars carefully craft. The body, however, tells a different story, one most people cannot control. One that reveals the truth if you know how to read it. Today, I want to share what I have learned. Not to make you paranoid or suspicious of everyone around you, but to give you the tools to protect yourself when it matters most. Because the ability to detect deception is not just about catching liars. It is about understanding human behavior at a deeper level, strengthening your relationships through genuine connection, and living with greater confidence in a world where the truth is often hidden beneath carefully chosen words. By the end of our journey together, you will possess something few people ever develop. The ability to see what others miss, to detect dishonesty without saying a single word, and to understand the complex psychological dance that happens beneath the surface of every human interaction. But first, we need to understand why traditional methods of lie detection fail so spectacularly, and why most of what you think you know about spotting lies is completely wrong. Let me ask you a question. How can you tell if someone is lying to you? If you thought about shifty eyes, fidgeting, or nervous behavior, you are not alone. For decades, these have been the supposed tells of deception popularized by movies, television, and even some outdated training programs. The problem? Research has consistently proven they are about as reliable as flipping a coin. In a landmark study at the University of California, researchers found that law enforcement officers, judges, psychiatrists, and college students all performed barely above chance levels when trying to detect deception based on traditional cues. Even more surprising, those whose professions involved regular lie detection showed no significant advantage over college students. Why are we so bad at spotting lies? The answer lies in our evolutionary history and cognitive biases. Humans evolved as social creatures. Our survival depended on cooperation and trust within our tribes. We developed what anthropologists call a truth bias, a natural tendency to believe what others tell us. This served us well in close-knit communities where deception could lead to ostracism, but it leaves us vulnerable in the modern world where we interact with countless strangers daily. Additionally, our understanding of deceptive behavior has been contaminated by persistent myths. Television detectives who always know when a suspect is lying have programmed us to look for the wrong signals. Even training programs for police and security personnel often perpetuate outdated methods with questionable scientific support. Caitlin Lawson, a former FBI behavioral analyst I interviewed for this article, put it bluntly, most people look for nervousness when they should be looking for cognitive load. Lying is primarily a mental task, not an emotional one. This distinction is crucial. Liars are not necessarily nervous, especially practiced ones. What they are doing is performing a complex cognitive juggling act. Creating a fictional narrative, remembering details of that narrative, monitoring your reactions, adjusting their story accordingly, suppressing the truth, and maintaining a natural demeanor, all simultaneously. This cognitive burden creates subtle but detectable changes in behavior that have nothing to do with nervousness or guilt. They are simply the external manifestations of an overworked brain. But here is where it gets interesting. Before we can detect these signs, we must first overcome our own biases and limitations. And to do that, we need to understand the psychological landscape of deception from both sides, the liar and the lie detector. To catch a liar, you must first understand why and how people lie. This requires empathy, not to excuse deception, but to recognize its patterns and motivations. People lie for three primary reasons: to gain advantage, to avoid punishment, or to protect someone's feelings. While the third category might seem benign, and often is, all three types of lies share common psychological and physiological characteristics. When someone constructs a lie, they engage in what psychologists call cognitive taxing. Essentially, their brain works harder than when telling the truth. This increased mental effort manifests in subtle behavioral changes that most people never notice. Consider this scenario. You ask a colleague where they were during an important meeting they missed. If telling the truth, their answer comes spontaneously, "I had a doctor's appointment I couldn't reschedule." If lying, their brain performs several operations simultaneously, inventing a plausible excuse, checking it for consistency with what you might already know, adjusting their facial expressions and tone to appear sincere, monitoring your reaction, and suppressing their knowledge of what really happened. This mental juggling act creates what researchers call processing delays, small but detectable pauses before answering straightforward questions. It also produces what behavioral psychologists term cognitive segregation, where the liar unconsciously distances themselves from their lie through subtle language and body language shifts. Truthful people own their stories, explains Zachary Lowe, a police interrogation specialist with 20 years of experience. Liars subtly distance themselves through language and physicality. They are subconsciously trying to separate themselves from the falsehood. This distancing appears in surprisingly consistent ways across cultures and contexts. Liars tend to use fewer first-person pronouns, I statements, employ more qualifying language, to the best of my recollection, as far as I know, and physically create distance through posture and positioning. They also face what psychologists call the illusion of transparency, the mistaken belief that their internal states, including deception, are more visible to others than they actually are. This creates a compensatory behavior pattern where liars often overdo aspects of their performance, particularly maintaining eye contact beyond what is natural in normal conversation. Understanding these psychological principles allows us to look beyond nervous fidgeting and shifty eyes to recognize the true indicators of deception. But there is another crucial component to becoming an effective lie detector: understanding and controlling your own biases. Before you can accurately read others, you must first read yourself. Our perception is clouded by cognitive biases that distort how we interpret the behavior of others, especially when deception may be involved. The first and perhaps most dangerous bias is what psychologists call the fundamental attribution error, our tendency to attribute others' behavior to their character rather than their circumstances. When someone exhibits signs that might indicate deception, we immediately jump to "they are a liar," rather than considering situational factors that might produce similar behaviors. Anxiety about being falsely accused can produce the exact same physiological responses as lying, explains Caitlin Lawson. That's why traditional polygraph tests have such high false positive rates. They measure stress responses, not deception itself. This creates a hazardous situation where nervous truth-tellers may appear deceptive while comfortable liars appear truthful. To overcome this, effective deception detection requires establishing a behavioral baseline for each individual rather than comparing them to a universal standard. The second major bias is confirmation bias, our tendency to notice evidence that supports our existing beliefs while ignoring contradictory information. Once we suspect someone of lying, we unconsciously search for evidence to confirm our suspicion, creating a dangerous feedback loop that can damage relationships and lead to false accusations. "I see this constantly in my work," Zachary Lowe told me. Investigators decide someone is guilty, then interpret everything through that lens. Innocent behaviors become obvious signs of guilt. It's a form of investigative tunnel vision that's responsible for countless miscarriages of justice. To combat these biases, professional interrogators use a technique called behavioral baseline analysis. Before assessing deception, They establish how a person behaves when relaxed and telling the truth by observing them during casual conversation about neutral topics. Only after establishing this individual baseline do they look for deviations that might indicate deception. This approach acknowledges an important truth. There is no universal tell that works for everyone. Each person has unique behavioral patterns that change under cognitive stress. Your job is not to memorize a checklist of deceptive behaviors, but to notice deviations from an individual's normal patterns. With these foundational principles established, we can now delve into the specific, observable signals that indicate someone might be lying to you, without you saying a word. Rather than isolated tells, deception reveals itself through clusters of behavior that occur together. Research shows that looking for single indicators leads to high error rates, while clusters of 3 or more behavioral changes can increase accuracy to over 80%. These clusters fall into 4 main categories: verbal content, voice quality, body language, and facial expressions. While we are focusing on nonverbal detection, understanding what constitutes deceptive speech patterns helps us recognize when to pay closer attention to nonverbal cues. Though our focus is nonverbal detection, speech patterns provide critical context for body language interpretation. Deceptive statements typically contain several distinct characteristics. First, narrative structure changes under deception. Truthful accounts generally follow chronological order with consistent detail levels throughout. Deceptive narratives often contain hot spots, areas with either excessive detail to establish credibility or conspicuous lack of detail to avoid contradictions. Second, liars display pronoun distancing. They unconsciously reduce use of first-person pronouns, I, me, my, and increase third-person or passive constructions. Rather than, I went to the store, they might say, there was a trip to the store. Third, qualifying language increases dramatically. Phrases like, to the best of my knowledge, as I recall, and if I remember correctly create plausible deniability and psychological distance from falsehoods. Finally, liars unconsciously leak information through what psychologists call linguistic slips. Moments where their language briefly reveals knowledge they claim not to have or contradicts their narrative. These verbal inconsistencies signal when to pay closer attention to nonverbal behavior. The voice contains powerful deception indicators that most people never consciously register. Unlike deliberately chosen words, vocal characteristics are largely automatic and difficult to control under cognitive stress. Pitch elevation is among the most reliable indicators. Under cognitive load, vocal pitch typically increases slightly. This change is subtle, rarely noticeable without baseline comparison but detectable by attentive listeners. Response latency, the timing of replies, changes distinctly under deception. Truthful answers to simple questions typically come immediately, while deceptive responses often follow brief but noticeable delays as the brain constructs a false narrative. Vocal quality itself transforms with increased throat clearing, speech errors, and what linguists call non-fluencies, appearing more frequently. While nervousness can cause similar patterns, the key difference is context and clustering with other deceptive indicators. Listen for unnatural speech rhythms, advises Caitlin Lawson. Truthful speech has a natural cadence. Deceptive speech often contains unusual pauses, particularly mid-sentence, as the person mentally reviews their statement for consistency. The body often contradicts the words coming out of a liar's mouth through subtle but observable inconsistencies. Unlike the popular myth of constant fidgeting, the most reliable indicators involve timing and congruence rather than specific movements. Asynchronous gesturing occurs when hand movements do not naturally align with speech content and rhythm. Truthful communication features gestures that precisely complement verbal content. Under deception, this natural synchronization deteriorates. Another powerful indicator is what body language experts call limbic freezing, moments of unnatural stillness that occur when the cognitive demands of lying temporarily override the autonomic nervous system. Rather than constant movement, practiced liars often display periods of unusual stillness interrupted by bursts of illustrative gesturing. Barrier creation, unconsciously placing objects between themselves and their conversation partner, increases under deceptive conditions. This might involve holding a coffee cup with both hands, crossing arms, or positioning items on a table to create physical separation. Finally, watch for contradictory movements, subtle head shakes during affirmative statements or nods during denials. These split-second incongruities reflect the brain briefly broadcasting the truth while the mouth speaks a lie. The body speaks its own language, explains Zachary Lowe, and it's a language most people haven't learned to read. When the body and words tell different stories, trust the body. It's much harder to control. The face holds perhaps the most revelatory deception indicators, yet they occur so quickly most people miss them entirely. These micro-expressions, emotional displays lasting less than 1/5 of a second, leak authentic feelings before conscious control can suppress them. First identified by renowned psychologist Dr. Paul Ekman, micro-expressions represent genuine emotional responses that contradict the emotion a person is trying to convey. They appear as fleeting expressions of fear, anger, disgust, or other emotions that flash across the face before being quickly suppressed and replaced with a manufactured expression. What makes micro-expressions so valuable for deception detection is their involuntary nature. Even the most disciplined liars cannot prevent them entirely. They occur because the limbic system, our emotional brain, responds faster than our conscious control mechanisms. Several types of micro-expressions are particularly relevant to deception detection. Fear micro-expressions often appear when liars worry about being caught. Look for momentary widening of the eyes with raised eyebrows and tightened lips lasting a fraction of a second. Duping delight manifests as brief flashes of inappropriate pleasure when a liar believes they are succeeding in their deception. This appears as a subtle smirk or smile that quickly disappears. Contempt shows as a distinctive one-sided mouth raise and is often visible when liars feel morally superior or disdainful of the person they are deceiving. Disgust micro-expressions, a brief nose wrinkle and upper lip raise, frequently appear when liars experience self-disgust about their own dishonesty. The face is constantly broadcasting truth, Caitlin Lawson explains, but most broadcasts last less than 200 milliseconds. Without training, people typically miss them entirely. Learning to recognize these expressions requires practice but dramatically improves deception detection accuracy. The key is developing peripheral awareness, observing the whole face rather than maintaining constant eye contact, which ironically causes you to miss these critical signals. Now that we understand the 4 clusters of deceptive behavior, let us explore how to integrate them into a comprehensive, real-time deception detection system. Effective lie detection is not about memorizing a checklist but developing a systematic approach that becomes second nature with practice. The following 5-step system synthesizes techniques used by elite interrogators and behavioral analysts into a practical framework anyone can learn. Before you can detect deception, you must understand how someone behaves when telling the truth. This requires observing them during relaxed, casual conversation about non-threatening topics. Pay particular attention to their natural speaking rate, typical gesture patterns, default posture, and standard eye movement patterns. Everyone has idiosyncratic behaviors that might look like deception tells but are actually just personal quirks. Identifying these prevents false positives later. I always start interviews with 5 minutes of casual conversation, explains Zachary Lowe. I ask about traffic, sports, the weather, anything neutral. This gives me their behavioral fingerprint when there's no reason to lie. For people you know well, you already have an intuitive baseline. For new acquaintances, create opportunities for relaxed interaction before addressing sensitive topics. This investment pays dividends when you need to assess truthfulness later. Once you have established a behavioral baseline, introduce questions that might prompt deception while observing for changes across all 4 behavior clusters. The most effective questions are open-ended and non-accusatory. Rather than asking, "Did you take the money?" which forces a binary response, ask, "What can you tell me about the missing funds?" This provides space for the person to speak freely, generating more behavioral data for analysis. As they respond, watch for significant deviations from their baseline behavior. Single deviations may be meaningless, but clusters of 3 or more changes across different channels, verbal, vocal, body, facial, signal potential deception. The key is noticing pattern breaks, Caitlin Lawson emphasizes. Not individual behaviors, but sudden changes from their normal communication style when the stakes increase. The first 3 to 5 seconds after a question are crucial for deception detection. This is when cognitive load peaks and before conscious control mechanisms fully activate. During this brief window, watch for microexpressions that contradict their verbal response, unnatural pauses before answering simple questions, repeating the question to buy processing time, sudden changes in breathing patterns, dry mouth indicators, licking lips, swallowing, brief freeze responses before animation resumes. These immediate reactions provide the most reliable indicators because they occur before conscious deception strategies fully deploy. Once a person settles into their narrative, deception becomes harder to detect. The truth is automatic, explains Zachary Lowe. Lies require construction. That construction period is your window of opportunity. As the conversation continues, observe how stress manifests in the individual. Different people show cognitive stress in different ways, falling into what psychologists call stress response styles. Some become unnaturally still when lying, freeze response, while others become more animated, flight response. Some become combative or overly detailed, fight response, while others show distinctive grooming behaviors like touching their face or adjusting clothing. The key insight is that stress responses remain relatively consistent within individuals but vary greatly between people. By identifying someone's characteristic stress response during baseline questioning, you can recognize when that same pattern emerges during critical questions. There's no universal stress response, Caitlin Lawson notes. What matters is the deviation from their personal normal. One person's deception might look like stillness, another's like animation. You're looking for the change, not the specific behavior. The final step involves subtly increasing cognitive burden to amplify deception indicators. This does not mean aggressive interrogation, but rather introducing elements that make maintaining a false narrative more difficult. One effective technique is reverse chronological questioning, asking the person to relate events backward rather than forward. This dramatically increases cognitive load for fabricated stories while barely affecting recall of genuine experiences. Another approach is introducing unexpected detail questions that a truthful person could easily answer but a liar would struggle with. What was the weather like that day? Or, who else was in the room? A third technique involves circling back to key points later in the conversation with slightly reworded questions. Truthful accounts remain consistent on core details despite rephrasing, while deceptive narratives often contain inconsistencies when approached from different angles. These techniques work because they target the fundamental asymmetry between truth and lies, explains Zachary Lowe. Truth is remembered. Lies are constructed. The more construction required, the more noticeable the behavioral indicators become. By implementing this 5-step system, you create a structured approach to deception detection that relies on observable behavior patterns rather than unreliable intuition or myths about specific tells. But this raises an important question. Once you suspect deception, what should you do about it? Detecting deception is only half the challenge. Responding effectively requires equal skill and consideration of your objectives. The appropriate response depends entirely on context and your relationship with the potential deceiver. When you detect potential deception from friends or family members, immediate confrontation rarely produces optimal outcomes. Instead, behavioral experts recommend several strategic approaches. First, create psychological safety that reduces the perceived need for deception. This might involve statements like, "I value honesty over comfort. I'd rather hear a difficult truth than a comforting lie." Second, address the underlying issue rather than the deception itself. Ask yourself, why might this person feel the need to lie? Are they afraid of your reaction? Protecting your feelings? Avoiding conflict? Addressing these root causes often resolves the deception indirectly. Third, when confrontation becomes necessary, use observation language rather than accusations. "I noticed you seemed uncomfortable when discussing the party last night," feels less threatening than, "I know you're lying about the party." The goal in personal relationships isn't to catch people in lies, but to create conditions where honesty feels safe, emphasizes Caitlin Lawson. Most personal deception comes from fear, not malice. Professional contexts require different strategies, particularly when power dynamics or financial interests are involved. In negotiations, identifying deception provides strategic advantage you may choose not to immediately reveal. Instead, you might probe inconsistencies with indirect questions. That's interesting. Could you walk me through how that would work in practice? When evaluating job candidates or potential business partners, deception indicators serve as valuable data points for decision-making without necessarily requiring confrontation. The information shapes your risk assessment rather than prompting an accusation. For managers addressing potential workplace dishonesty, the strategic revelation approach often proves effective. This involves privately revealing one piece of contradictory evidence and observing how the person responds. Honest mistakes produce different behavioral responses than deliberate deception. In business settings, I rarely call out lies directly, explains Zachary Lowe. Instead, I signal that I'm gathering information. I'm trying to reconcile what you're telling me with what the data shows. This gives people room to correct course without losing face. Some situations, potential fraud, serious relationship breaches, or security concerns, require more direct approaches to addressing deception. The confrontation pyramid, developed by forensic psychologists, offers a structured escalation path. Level 1. Express confusion about inconsistencies without accusation. I'm confused about something. You mentioned being home all night, but your car was seen downtown. Level 2. Present contradictory evidence directly but without accusatory language. The surveillance footage shows something different than what you've described. Level 3. Directly name the concern while maintaining professionalism. The evidence suggests you haven't been truthful about your involvement. Level 4. Full confrontation with consequences. We know you've been lying, and here's what happens next. Starting at the lowest necessary level preserves dignity and leaves room for honest explanation of apparent inconsistencies. The art is matching your response to the severity of the situation, advises Caitlin Lawson. A white lie about liking a gift doesn't deserve the same response as deception about finances or fidelity. In all contexts, effective response to detected deception requires balancing accountability with empathy, understanding why people lie, and considering what outcome would best serve the relationship or situation. With these response strategies in mind, let us address some common questions and misconceptions about nonverbal lie detection. As you develop your deception detection skills, several common questions and misconceptions will inevitably arise. Addressing these helps refine your approach and avoid common pitfalls. This concern reflects a common misunderstanding about the purpose of these skills. Effective deception detection isn't about assuming everyone is lying. It's about accurately reading behavioral cues when deception might be relevant. Think of it like defensive driving, suggests Zachary Lowe. You don't assume every driver will crash into you, but you stay alert to potential dangers. Deception detection is social defensive driving. The key to avoiding paranoia is proper baseline analysis. Understanding how people normally behave prevents misinterpreting ordinary nervousness or quirks as deception. Additionally, remembering that behavioral indicators suggest areas for further exploration, not definitive proof, keeps perspective balanced. Research shows that even practiced liars display detectable behavioral indicators under sufficient cognitive load. While they may suppress some common tells, the multitasking demands of complex deception inevitably produce observable stress responses. The most dangerous liars aren't those who show no indicators, explains Caitlin Lawson. They're those whose baseline behavior already incorporates deceptive patterns, making deviation detection more difficult. Psychopaths and pathological liars present unique challenges because their baseline itself involves deceptive behavior patterns. In these rare cases, focus shifts from behavioral analysis to fact-checking and consistency evaluation rather than nonverbal cues. For most deception scenarios, however, even skilled liars reveal themselves through behavioral inconsistencies when properly observed. While behavioral analysis informs law enforcement investigations, courts generally do not accept nonverbal deception detection as standalone evidence. The scientific consensus holds that while behavioral analysis can achieve accuracy rates significantly above chance, it rarely reaches the beyond reasonable doubt standard required in criminal proceedings. We use behavioral analysis to guide investigations, not prove cases, clarifies Zachary Lowe. It tells us where to look for hard evidence, not replaces it. This distinction is important for civilian applications as well. Behavioral indicators should prompt further inquiry or influence risk assessment, not serve as definitive proof of deception in consequential decisions. Cultural background significantly influences baseline behavior but affects deception indicators less than commonly believed. Research across cultures shows that while baseline behaviors vary widely, the core principle remains consistent. Deception creates observable deviations from individual baselines regardless of cultural background. Different cultures have different display rules for emotions and different comfort levels with eye contact or physical space, notes Caitlin Lawson. But cognitive load produces detectable changes across all cultural backgrounds when you properly establish individual baselines. The key adaptation for cross-cultural deception detection is spending more time establishing accurate baselines and recognizing that certain behaviors, like eye contact patterns, have different baseline norms in different cultures. Like any powerful tool, deception detection skills can be used constructively or destructively. The ethical application involves several principles. First, use these skills as a protective measure, not a means to unnecessarily invade privacy or create power imbalances. Second, maintain appropriate skepticism about your own accuracy. No one achieves perfect detection rates, and false positives can damage relationships. Third, consider context and proportionality. Minor social lies often serve prosocial functions and may not warrant confrontation. Finally, focus on creating environments where honesty feels safe rather than catching people in lies. In healthy relationships, these skills should ultimately make deception less necessary, not just more detectable. The highest use of these skills isn't catching lies, Caitlin Lawson emphasizes. It's creating relationships where people feel safe telling the truth, even when it's difficult. Like any complex skill, nonverbal deception detection requires deliberate practice to develop. The following structured approach helps build competence systematically rather than through trial and error. Begin by practicing baseline establishment in low-stakes environments. During casual conversations with friends or colleagues, consciously observe their typical speaking rate and rhythm, gesture patterns and frequency, default posture and position shifts, eye movement patterns, vocal characteristics, pitch, volume, cadence. After several minutes of observation, mentally note their behavioral patterns. With practice, this baseline analysis becomes automatic rather than requiring conscious effort. I recommend practice sessions where you focus on just one channel at a time, suggests Zachary Lowe. Spend one conversation focusing solely on vocal patterns, another on gestures, until observation becomes integrated. Once comfortable with baseline establishment, practice identifying behavioral changes during conversations. When topics shift from casual to potentially sensitive areas, notice any deviations across the 4 behavior clusters. A simple exercise involves asking friends increasingly personal questions, with permission, and observing how their behavior changes as topics become more sensitive. This builds pattern recognition in a supportive environment without actual deception. For more structured practice, television interviews with politicians or celebrities often contain moments of obvious discomfort or evasion that provide clear examples of behavioral changes under stress. News interviews are perfect practice material, explains Caitlin Lawson. Watch with the sound off first to focus on nonverbals, then with sound to integrate verbal content. Pay special attention when tough questions arise. As baseline analysis and deviation detection become more natural, begin integrating these skills into relevant life situations. This might include job interviews as the interviewer, negotiation scenarios, important business discussions, situations where you need to evaluate credibility. Remember that application should remain proportional and context appropriate. Not every conversation warrants full deception analysis, and overuse can create unnecessary suspicion or distance in relationships. These aren't skills you use constantly, cautions Zachary Lowe. They're tools you keep available for situations where truth assessment matters. The most challenging aspect of developing deception detection skills is obtaining accurate feedback. Unlike many skills where results are immediately apparent, you often cannot verify deception with certainty in real-time situations. Several approaches can help overcome this limitation. Practice with partners who provide honest feedback about when they were truthful or deceptive after the exercise concludes. Review recorded interactions where deception was later confirmed, analyzing what indicators you noticed or missed. Participate in structured training programs that include verified deception scenarios with expert feedback. Without calibration, you risk developing confident incompetence, warns Caitlin Lawson. The most dangerous deception detectors are those who believe they're skilled, but have never tested their accuracy. With consistent practice across these 4 phases, most people can significantly improve their deception detection accuracy from the roughly 54% accuracy rate of untrained observers to 75 to 80% accuracy with proper training. As we conclude our exploration of nonverbal deception detection, it is important to integrate these techniques into a cohesive approach that enhances rather than complicates your interactions. The essence of effective deception detection lies not in memorizing a catalog of tells, but in developing observational awareness that becomes second nature. With practice, you begin noticing behavioral patterns without conscious effort, allowing your attention to remain on the conversation itself rather than an analytical checklist. This integration happens through what psychologists call chunking, the brain's ability to package complex information into manageable units. Just as experienced drivers simultaneously monitor multiple aspects of traffic without conscious thought, experienced deception detectors process behavioral information automatically. The progression typically follows 4 stages. First, conscious incompetence. You recognize deceptive behaviors only after reviewing interactions and miss them in real time. Second, conscious competence. You detect indicators during conversations but must actively focus on observation. Third, unconscious competence. Behavioral analysis happens automatically alongside normal conversation. Fourth, intuitive integration. Your conscious and unconscious systems work together, with gut feelings prompting closer attention to specific behavioral clusters. The goal isn't becoming a human lie detector, explains Zachary Lowe. It's developing an accurate internal warning system that tells you when something requires closer examination. This integrated awareness serves multiple purposes beyond deception detection. It enhances emotional intelligence by improving your ability to read others' emotional states, strengthens negotiation skills by revealing unspoken concerns, and deepens personal relationships through greater attunement to others' authentic experiences. Most importantly, this skill set creates a feedback loop of increasing social awareness. As your ability to read others improves, your self-awareness typically increases as well. You become more conscious of your own nonverbal communication, more attuned to how others perceive you, and more effective in all forms of interpersonal interaction. The ultimate benefit isn't catching liars, concludes Caitlin Lawson. It's developing deeper understanding of human communication in all its complexity. Deception detection is simply one application of that broader awareness. We live in an age where truth seems increasingly elusive. Political discourse, social media, marketing, and even personal relationships sometimes appear dominated by strategic dishonesty rather than authentic communication. In this environment, the ability to discern truth from deception becomes not merely a practical skill but almost a philosophical necessity, a way to maintain genuine connection in a world where words alone cannot always be trusted. Yet, as we develop this ability, we must remain mindful of its purpose. The highest use of deception detection is not to catch others in lies, but to protect what matters while creating spaces where honesty can flourish. When applied with wisdom and compassion, these skills do not make us more suspicious but more discerning, not more isolated but more genuinely connected, not more cynical but more clear-sighted about the complex reality of human communication. The paradox of deception detection is that its ultimate goal is a world where such skills become less necessary, where relationships are built on sufficient trust and psychological safety that deception itself diminishes. Until that ideal is reached, however, the ability to read the unspoken truth in others' behavior remains an essential capacity for navigating our complex social world, protecting what matters while remaining open to authentic connection. As you continue developing these skills, remember that the most powerful lie detector is not a technology or technique, but a human connection strong enough that truth becomes the easier choice. In your relationships, strive not just to detect deception but to make honesty feel safe, even when the truth is difficult. Because in the end, we catch lies without words, not to expose others but to discover truth, the foundation of every meaningful human connection. The ability to detect deception without saying a word is not about catching people in lies. It's about creating relationships where people feel safe telling the truth, even when it's difficult.